The scalding coffee spilled down Joanna Powell's chest, soaking through her dark blue uniform and white apron. The burning liquid seeped through the fabric, searing the skin beneath. Her scream pierced the refined atmosphere of the sterling like a blade, silencing conversations and the soft clink of crystal glasses in an instant. She collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as angry red blisters already began forming across her collarbone and trembling hands. And Clifford Jones smiled. He actually smiled as he towered over her, his expensive light blue dress shirt with rolled sleeves unmarred by a single drop. Designer shoes just inches from where she knelt in agony. His Patek Philippe watch probably cost more than 3 years of her salary. His car outside, more than the mortgage on the house she could never afford. And he was smiling, holding his phone camera steady, recording her pain like it was content created for his entertainment. That's what happens when you don't move fast enough, he sneered, his voice carrying throughout the now silent restaurant. Maybe next time you'll remember who signs your pathetic paycheck. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The other wait staff froze in place, eyes downcast, knowing intervention meant losing the jobs they desperately needed. The wealthy patrons studied their phones or their plates with sudden fascination, pretending they hadn't witnessed assault in broad daylight. In this glittering restaurant in Manhattan's financial district, Clifford Jones was untouchable royalty, the son of real estate mogul Richard Jones, a man whose $3.2 billion fortune had long ago placed him above such trivial concerns as law or basic human decency. But behind him, a shadow moved. A Korean man in a perfectly tailored black three-piece suit slowly lowered his wine glass. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the gesture of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. His white shirt, open slightly at the collar, revealed the edge of dark tattoos creeping up his neck. The man's face betrayed nothing as he observed the scene. His expression remained perfectly neutral, but his eyes changed. Something ancient and dangerous flickered behind them. A cold calculation that spoke of violence seen and violence delivered. Heo Kongmin had watched enough. And Clifford Jones had just made the worst mistake of his privileged life. If this story resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button now. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Heo Kongmin sat in the darkened corner of the Sterling, his eyes reflecting the cold precision of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating shadows. 15 years ago, he had stepped onto American soil with the calloused hands of a former Korean Special Forces operative and a heart full of legitimate dreams. But the system didn't want his honesty, it wanted his submission. When corporate greed and bureaucratic corruption tried to grind him down, he didn't break, he evolved. He built an empire in the gray, an import-export business that served as a flawless silk shroud over a network of justice the law was too cowardly to provide. His philosophy was simple: when the system fails, someone must restore the balance. He became the guardian for those the banks ignored and the monster for those the law protected. Every move he made was fueled by the memory of a factory fire years ago, the smell of smoke and the sight of his younger sister's body, an accidental casualty of a wealthy owner's cost-cutting measures. That fire had never stopped burning inside him. The laughter of Clifford, the billionaire's son, cut through his thoughts like broken glass. Heo stood, his black three-piece suit cutting a sharp, lethal silhouette against the restaurant's opulent gold trim. He moved with a predator's grace, reaching Joanna before she could collapse. Medical care. And an apology, Heo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded the room. Clifford sneered, his sky-blue shirt stained with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he barked, as his private security detail swarmed the floor. Heo didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a matte black business card, and pressed it into Joanna's trembling hand. "Call me," he whispered. When the police arrived, the officers immediately moved toward Clifford with deferential nods, their hands resting on their belts as they glared at Heo. The dynamic was clear: wealth bought the badge. Heo didn't argue. He simply pulled out his phone, made a single 30-second call to a contact in the commissioner's office, and waited. Seconds later, the lead officer's radio chirped. The shift in the room was palpable. The officer's face went pale, his posture snapping from aggressive to apologetic as he turned his attention toward a stunned Clifford. Heo adjusted his cuffs, his gaze lingering on the scar across his cheek, a permanent reminder of the price of his principles. He walked toward the exit, pausing only to look back at the chaos he had just recalibrated. "This is only the beginning," he murmured, disappearing into the night, a dark guardian driven by demons that ensured no one else would have to burn. Richard Jones sat atop a $3.2 billion throne built from the wreckage of displaced communities and the blood of the invisible. A real estate mogul who viewed labor laws as mere suggestions, Richard had mastered the art of the workplace accident, silencing survivors with ironclad non-disclosure agreements and heavy-handed political favors. His son, Clifford, was the rotting fruit of this poison tree. At 35, Clifford's only talent was spending the wealth generated by the very people he despised. His record was a litany of hit-and-runs and assaults, all vanished by the Jones legal machine, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and an Instagram feed of hollow luxury. In the sterilized quiet of the hospital, Heo Kong-min stood by Joanna's bed. The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the raw scent of her pain. Second-degree burns blossomed across her chest, a physical manifestation of Clifford's cruelty. Her hands shook as she looked at the mounting medical bills on her bedside table. "I can't stay here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My grandmother needs her heart medication. If I don't work, we lose everything." Heo's expression remained a mask of stone, but his eyes darkened as he pulled a file from his coat. His research team had spent the night digging, and what they found was more than just a pattern of greed. "Your brother, Marcus," Heo said softly. "He worked for Jones Enterprises, didn't he?" Joanna's eyes filled with sudden, sharp tears. He was 21. He saw things, the unsafe scaffolding, the stolen wages. He filed a complaint with OSHA, and a man in a dark suit came to our door. He told Marcus to be quiet if he wanted us to stay safe. She choked back a sob. Marcus went to work the next morning and never came home. The police said he just walked away. They won't even look for him. She reached out, grasping Heo's sleeve with desperate strength. "Please. I don't care about the burns. Please help me find my brother." Heo felt a familiar, frigid wind howl through his soul. He reached into his pocket and touched the edges of an old, scorched photograph, the only thing left of his own sister after the factory fire. The wealthy owners who had killed her were different men, but they were the same breed of predator. He saw Marcus in his sister's eyes, he saw his own failure in Joanna's plea. "I will find him," Heo promised, his voice devoid of warmth but heavy with an absolute, lethal certainty. "And I will make them pay for every second he has been gone." As he walked out, the vow settled over him like armor. This was no longer just about an apology. It was a war against an empire, and Heo Kong-min was the only one willing to burn it down. Clifford's Ferrari was gone. The pristine, secured garage stood empty, save for a single black origami crane resting where the driver's seat should have been. It was a delicate, haunting symbol of vengeance that felt heavier than the ton of Italian steel it replaced. Tucked beneath the wing was a note, the ink as sharp as a blade: "Your privilege won't protect you anymore." When Clifford checked the security footage, he found only a loop of static. For the first time in his life, the air in his penthouse felt thin. Across the city, Heo Kong-min sat in a low-lit booth opposite Sarah Chen. For 2 years, Sarah had chased the Jones empire, only to be met with a wall of signed NDAs and terrified witnesses. She looked at the encrypted drive Heo pushed across the table with a mixture of hope and horror. It contained the digital ghosts of the Jones legacy, internal emails discussing disposable workers, offshore accounts used for bribes, and a list of names that included Marcus. "This is stolen, Heo," Sarah whispered, her journalistic ethics warring with her thirst for the truth. "I can't use this without a source, and no court will touch it." Heo's gaze remained unwavering. "The courts are owned by the man who killed Marcus. Sometimes justice requires getting your hands dirty so others can stay clean. You don't need a court, you need the public to see the rot." As Sarah began to sift through the files, the psychological noose tightened around Clifford. His world began to fray at the edges. His black card was declined at a high-end lounge, his dinner reservations at the city's most exclusive tables were mysteriously lost. Even his inner circle, sensing a shift in the wind, suddenly had reasons to be elsewhere. When he finally cornered his father in his mahogany-clad office, Richard didn't even look up from his ledger. "Someone is coming for me, Dad," Clifford hissed, his voice cracking with a paranoia he didn't have the vocabulary to describe. "The car, the money, it's all being erased." "Stop being dramatic," Richard replied, his voice a glacier of indifference. "I built this empire so you wouldn't have to be a victim. If you can't protect your own playground, handle it yourself for once." The dismissal was the final blow to Clifford's ego, leaving him isolated in his glass tower. But Hio was already moving beyond the boy. On the outskirts of the industrial district, his operatives had flagged a warehouse with no registered business but a power draw that suggested heavy machinery or high-end security. No one entered or exited during the day, yet the silence felt manufactured. "We go in tonight," Hio said, his voice a low promise to the shadows. The time for psychological games was ending, the time for reclamation had begun. The warehouse stood like a tomb in the industrial district, its windows blackened and its vents humming with a rhythmic, mechanical drone. Hio moved with his team through the service entrance, his movements silent and lethal. They bypassed the outer perimeter with surgical ease, noting that the security cameras were angled inward, designed not to detect intruders, but to monitor those trapped inside. The front section was a clever ruse, a half-hearted display of legitimate electronics assembly, but the heavy, reinforced door at the back told the true story. When Hio's specialist bypassed the biometric lock, the hiss of the pneumatic seal sounded like a gasp for air. As the door swung open, the stench of unwashed bodies and stagnant fear hit them like a physical blow. Under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights, 43 souls were revealed, huddled in caged sections. Men, women, and even children worked with trembling hands, their eyes hollowed out by 18-hour shifts and the constant threat of the baton. This wasn't a factory, it was a modern-day slave camp. Passports were stacked in a glass case like trophies of war, and the scars on the workers' backs spoke of the price of resistance. Hio's jaw clenched so tight his teeth felt ready to shatter. His hands, usually as steady as a marksman's, began to shake with a controlled, volcanic rage. He moved toward the back of the room, where a solitary figure lay curled on a thin mat. "Marcus," Hio whispered. The young man who looked up was a ghost of the vibrant brother Joanna had described. Emaciated and broken, his face a map of bruises and jagged scars, Marcus Powell blinked at the light as if it were a dream. When Hio mentioned his name, the boy flinched, his mind too fractured by torture to recognize his own identity. "Joanna," Marcus croaked, his voice barely a rasp. "Is she? Did they get her too?" "She's alive," Hio promised, kneeling beside him and placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "She's waiting for you. I'm taking you home." As Marcus collapsed into a fit of jagged sobs, Hio's team moved with military efficiency, documenting every cage, every wound, and every confiscated document. This was the evidence Richard Jones couldn't pay to erase. Hio looked at the broken boy and saw his sister's face, the memory of her screams in the fire merging with the silence of this warehouse. Miles away, Richard Jones sat in his study as his phone vibrated. The news of the breach drained the color from his face, leaving only a cold, calculating mask. "Clean it up," he ordered, his voice devoid of humanity. "Make the witnesses disappear. Burn the site if you have to." But as he hung up, a sense of dread he hadn't felt in decades settled in his chest. For the first time, Richard Jones didn't just have a legal problem. He had a hunter. Clifford Jones moved through the underground parking garage like a man trapped in a gilded cage. His security detail formed a human shield around him, their hands hovering over concealed holsters. He was 3 days into a nightmare he couldn't buy his way out of, and the silence of the concrete vault felt like a held breath. Then, the world went black. The darkness was instantaneous and absolute. In the void, the air filled with the muffled thuds of tactical strikes and the sharp, rhythmic hiss of suppressed gunfire. There were no screams, only the heavy sound of bodies hitting pavement. When the emergency lights finally flickered to life, the garage was a graveyard of unconscious guards. Clifford was gone. He awoke to the biting sting of plastic zip ties and the smell of damp concrete. When the hood was ripped from his head, the fluorescent glare revealed Hio Kongmin standing before him, his shadow stretching long across the industrial floor. "You have no idea what you've started," Clifford spat, his voice cracking through a mask of trembling arrogance. "My father will pay anything you want. But when I get out, I will hunt you down and bury you." Hio didn't respond with words. He reached out and turned a monitor toward Clifford. The screen flickered to life, a silent parade of horrors. Clifford saw the warehouse cages, the hollow eyes of the children, and the jagged, weeping scars on Marcus Powell's back. He saw the cold data, 127 people enslaved, 19 dead and buried in unmarked graves beneath Jones' construction sites. "I didn't know," Clifford whimpered, his bravado dissolving into the gray light of the room. I just spent the money." I didn't know about the cages. Your lifestyle was funded by their suffering, Hio said, his voice a low, terrifying calm. You poured scalding coffee on Joanna for your amusement while your father enslaved her brother for profit. You consumed the fruits of this exploitation without question, and in the world I come from, ignorance is not innocence. It is a choice. Clifford broke. The heir to a $3 billion empire began to sob, his pleas for mercy echoing off the cold steel walls. Hio remained unmoved, his eyes as hard as the stones of the factory fire that had claimed his own sister. The vibration of a phone interrupted the crying. Hio pulled Clifford's device from his pocket and answered. I will destroy you, Richard Jones's voice boomed over the line, thick with a desperate, impotent rage. I have resources you can't even imagine. Check your news feeds, Mr. Jones, Hio replied. As he spoke, the world outside was shifting. Federal agents were breaching the Jones Enterprises glass tower. Sarah Chen's exposé was flashing across every screen in the country, and the Treasury Department had already moved to freeze the offshore accounts that fueled the family's reach. The board of directors was already voting for removal. Your empire is already falling, Hio said, looking down at the broken man at his feet. This call isn't about your money. It's about your son's survival. Would you like me to write the final confrontation where Hio presents his terms for Clifford's release, or should we move to the courtroom climax? Hio's movements were fluid, almost clinical, as he laid 3 objects onto the scarred wooden table. The metallic thud of the loaded pistol echoed first, followed by the soft click of a USB drive and the crisp rustle of legal documents. 3 paths, Clifford, Hio said, his voice a low, steady vibration in the cold room. Death by your own hand. A full testimony against your father's empire. Or the total transfer of your inheritance to the victim's fund. Choose one, or I choose for you. Clifford's breath came in ragged hitches. This is insane. How do I know you'll even let me go? He lurched forward, his eyes wild. My father, he'll kill me if I testify. He'll find me. You never gave your victims choices, Hio countered, unmoved by the young man's trembling. You never considered their fear while you lived off the interest of their agony. Now you understand what powerlessness feels like. The only difference is I'm giving you options they never had. A digital clock on the wall hummed, the red numbers bleeding away the seconds. Clifford spiraled. This isn't real, he hissed, before erupting into a fit of curses, threatening Hio with every connection he possessed. When that failed, he turned to bargaining. I'll pay you. Millions. More than those documents are worth. Just let me walk. But Hio remained a statue of judgment. Slowly, the fire in Clifford died, replaced by a hollow, racking sob. He slumped in the chair, staring at the pistol, then at the USB drive. In the silence, a realization dawned, the kind that breaks a man before it builds him. His father hadn't protected him out of love, he had protected him as an asset, a legacy to be polished. His entire life was a monument built on a graveyard. For the first time, looking at his own trembling hands, Clifford felt something heavier than fear, shame. He reached out, his fingers bypassing the cold steel of the gun. He grabbed the USB drive and the documents. I'll do it, Clifford whispered, his voice cracking but firm. I'll testify. I'll give it all back. But not for you. For them. For what my family took. Hio's eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of genuine surprise. Then prove it. Tomorrow, public testimony. No turning back. Clifford nodded, a terrified, broken man choosing a hard truth over a comfortable lie. Miles away, the glass walls of a penthouse office shattered. Richard Jones roared in futile rage as his phone buzzed with the notification that the board had stripped him of his title. Criminal indictments were already hitting the wire, his own son was the lead witness. Richard didn't wait. He grabbed a false passport, sprinting for his private jet. But as the engines roared to life, the pilot didn't head for the coast. The plane taxied toward a wall of flashing blue and red lights. Hio's reach was longer than any flight path. As federal agents swarmed the tarmac, Richard Jones's arrest was broadcast live to a nation that had waited far too long for justice. The media circus surrounding the federal courthouse was a sea of flashing bulbs and shouting reporters, but a sudden silence fell as Clifford Jones stepped out of an armored SUV. He wore no designer suit, no silk tie, and no arrogance. In a simple, off-the-rack white shirt, he looked smaller, more human, and profoundly broken. Inside, the air in the courtroom was heavy with the scent of old wood and the weight of impending history. Clifford's testimony was a surgical strike. He didn't just speak, he dismantled his father's legacy brick by brick. He named every official who had accepted a briefcase of cash, provided the encrypted passwords to offshore accounts holding $800 million, and detailed the horrific logistics of the toxic waste disposal that had poisoned the warehouse district. He made no excuses for his own hand in the machinery, his voice cracking only when he admitted to the cover-ups he had personally facilitated. The prosecution followed with a devastating parade of victims. Marcus Powell, leaning on a cane but standing tall, and Joanna Powell, her skin still mapped with the scars of the fire, spoke the truth of the job creators' cruelty. Parallel to Clifford's financial revelations, they provided the human cost, the lives bartered for a higher profit margin. Richard Jones sat at the defense table, his face a mask of purple-tinged fury. Even as his own emails, discussing how to make problems disappear, were projected onto the screen, he spat at the floor. "I built this city," he shouted, his defense a desperate cry of entitlement. "I am a job creator." The dismantling was systematic. The jury needed only 3 hours to return a verdict, guilty on all 47 counts. The judge, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity, looked Richard in the eye as she handed down the 35-year sentence. "Your victims were not disposable," she said, her voice like a gavel strike. "Wealth does not place you above the law." In a separate hearing, Clifford pleaded guilty to assault and conspiracy. His cooperation earned him 7 years, but the true sentence was the $18 million inheritance he signed away to the victims' fund. His public apology was short, punctuated by genuine tears that the cameras caught in high definition. In the back of the public gallery, partially obscured by the shadows of a marble pillar, Heo watched. There was no smirk of triumph on his face, only the quiet stillness of a man who had completed a difficult task. This was justice, cold and necessary, yet the cost remained etched in the eyes of the people on the stand. As the court adjourned, the world outside shifted. Sarah Chen's latest exposé hit the wires, revealing the shadow role of the mysterious figure who had forced the first domino to fall. The public was instantly polarized. Was Heo a vigilante hero or a dangerous criminal? By the time federal agents moved to question the man in the gallery, the seat was empty. Heo had vanished back into the gray spaces of the city, the guardian now becoming the hunted. The golden letters that once screamed Jones Enterprises had been replaced by a modest, slate-gray plaque, the Powell Workers' Rights Foundation. A year had passed, and the skyscraper that was once a monument to greed now hummed with the quiet industry of restoration. Funded by the carcass of the Jones Empire, the foundation had become a sanctuary for those the law had once ignored. Joanna Powell adjusted the collar of her blazer as she stepped into the boardroom. The scars on her chest were still there, jagged silver maps of a night that had nearly broken her, but she no longer hid them. As the director of victim services, she carried them like medals. She opened the board meeting not with a financial report, but with a new initiative for whistleblower safe houses. Beside her sat Marcus, the outreach coordinator. His physical trauma was evident in the way he walked, and the ghosts of the warehouse still haunted his sleep, but his voice was unwavering. He spent his days at universities, turning his suffering into the foundation of what the media now called the Powell Act, newly passed legislation that held corporate executives personally liable for the blood on their balance sheets. The 43 workers rescued that night were no longer ghosts in the machinery. Some had returned home with the compensation needed to rebuild their lives, others stayed, working within the foundation to guide those who were currently where they had once been. Miles away, in a stark prison library, Clifford Jones sat surrounded by the smell of old paper. He looked aged, his face hollowed by the weight of atonement. He spent his hours teaching inmates to read and writing letters of apology that he knew would likely never be opened. "I was a monster who thought he was a king," he told a visiting journalist, his voice devoid of his former silkiness. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew redemption was a mountain he might never finish climbing. He was simply trying to be a man instead of a legacy. His father, Richard, occupied a different world, a maximum security cell where his name carried no weight and his remaining years were measured in concrete. He remained unrepentant, a cautionary tale of a man who believed his bank account was a shield against morality. His empire was gone, dissolved into the very lives he had tried to crush. Even the Sterling had changed. No longer a playground for the cruel, it was now a worker-owned cooperative where the staff shared in the profits and the dignity. Joanna visited occasionally, sitting at a corner table and watching the waitstaff move with a grace born of respect rather than fear. Healing was slow, and the trauma of the past remained a quiet hum in the background of their lives. But as Joanna looked out over the city from the Foundation's windows, she finally smiled. The power had shifted. The victims had become the architects of a new world, and though the guardian who started it all was nowhere to be found, his work was written in every life that had been reclaimed. Heo Kongmin sat in a corner booth, the dim light of the evening service casting long, sharp shadows across the table. The federal investigation had eventually withered. Without Clifford's testimony against him and with his legitimate holdings impeccably insulated, the law found nothing to grasp. His private security firm had expanded, now a fortress for the vulnerable, while his shadow operations evolved into a more surgical, quiet machinery. He wore a charcoal suit, his presence as measured and predatory as ever. Across the room, the harmony of the restaurant fractured. A wealthy patron, face flushed with wine and entitlement, began berating a young server. It wasn't a physical blow, but the verbal cruelty was sharp enough to draw blood. The other diners looked into their plates, retreating into the safety of silence. The server's eyes welled with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched a tray. Heo set down his teacup. The ceramic click was barely audible, yet the patron's tirade died in his throat as his eyes met Heo's. There was no rage in that gaze, only a cold, bottomless awareness that made the man's skin crawl. The patron stammered an apology, dropped an oversized tip, and fled into the night. The powerful will always exist, Heo's inner voice mused as the server offered a bewildered, grateful nod. The system will always have cracks. And I will always be watching from the shadows. Later, Heo stood in the sleek, glass-walled offices of the Powell Foundation. Joanna looked out at the city lights, her silhouette strong and certain. Do you regret it? She asked softly, not turning around. The things you had to do to make this happen. I regret that they were necessary, Heo replied. But I do not regret the outcome. Neither do I, Joanna admitted, her voice tinged with a lingering sadness. But I wish there were another way. Perhaps one day there will be. Till then. He left the sentence hanging, a silent pact between the law and the shadow. As Heo walked the midnight streets, he watched the world through a lens of quiet vigilance. He saw an illegal eviction halted by a well-timed negotiation and a predator cornered in an alley, facing the sudden, sharp reality of consequence. He was not a hero. Heroes needed the light of the sun to validate their deeds. He was a guardian, and guardians operated in the dark. Back in a new restaurant, at a new table, a different young woman poured his tea. He noticed the faint, purple blooming of bruises on her wrist. Heo's eyes narrowed, the predator within stirring once more. Are you all right? He asked, his voice a low, grounding. Her hesitation, that split-second look of calculated fear, told him everything he needed to know. He reached into his pocket and slid a small, plain card across the linen. If you need help. She took it with trembling fingers as he sat back, once again alone, yet carrying the weight of every soul he had pulled from the fire. Somewhere, right now, the powerful are laughing. But somewhere, right now, a man is watching, waiting, protecting. Asterisk the Powell Workers' Rights Foundation, 2,347 victims helped. Asterisk the Powell Act, 89,000 workers protected from exploitation. Asterisk the work continues. Remember, the most dangerous person in the room is the one quietly watching.